Welcome to STAT's virtual event, Putting AI to the Test, in partnership with the Gordon and Betty Moore Foundation. Thanks to you all for joining us. I'm Casey Ross, National Technology Correspondent here at STAT. I'm sure you know how this works by now, but before we get started, a few quick things. I'm crowdsourcing my job today. So all of you in the crowd, I would love you to ask questions of the speakers, and you don't need to wait until the end. Please jump in with a question when you have one, and I'll try to ask it live. To ask a question, please use the Q&A feature to type it. Do not put your questions in the chat. In the Q&A window, you should also be able to see the questions that other attendees have asked, and you can upvote the questions you'd like to most see us answer live. Again, please don't wait for the end. Your questions are what make these events engaging and fun. We want to hear from you, and thanks again for being here. Before we get started, I'd like to welcome Dr. Tommy Wang. He's the program officer at the Gordon and Betty Moore Foundation for a partner introduction for today's event.
Thanks for the introduction, Casey. In my program officer role at the Gordon and Betty Moore Foundation, I lead our Diagnostic Excellence Initiative's technology strategy with a focus on assessing the potential of new technologies to improve diagnostic performance. I want to thank Casey and STAT News for organizing this panel today, as the topic, Putting AI to the Test, is a major motivation of our technology strategy. The healthcare community increasingly highlights the promise and risk related to new artificial intelligence and machine learning technologies that have emerged in recent years. The excitement around potential applications requires testing the claims of performance and clinical impact that are made by developers of these new technologies. To move towards any type of deployment, we require clarity on how to best approach model transparency, validation, evaluation, and monitoring, with a focus on how different populations are impacted. Much of our recent grant making related to clinical machine learning has exactly taken this focus. Theory, frameworks, and guidance are all useful starting points here. However, much of our recent activity is inspired by a comment from Casey that we must move beyond declaration. In that spirit, we have a portfolio of grantees that is about demonstration, deployment, and eventually diffusion of standards that address testing models. I'll be a bit more specific on what I mean when I say standards. These could be standard definitions on clinical concepts and outcomes, standard methods to operationalize agreed upon definitions, standard performance metrics and agreed upon performance thresholds, and standard approaches to measurement, evaluation, and reporting of those performance metrics. And this type of measurement applies both to a model's analytic performance, but more importantly, to a model's ultimate impact on patient outcomes and clinical behavior. So what are some examples of the projects in this portfolio of demonstration grants? Well, two grantees joined me in this panel today, and I'll let them describe their recently launched work themselves. But I can provide three additional examples. Co-investigators at Vanderbilt and Duke, with collaborators at the Coalition for Health AI, are developing and testing a maturity model geared towards a health system's ability to self-assess strengths and weaknesses for the development and deployment of AI technology. A second project involves funding a collaborative multi-institutional approach to predictive clinical model audits that will identify and promote dissemination of the generalizable aspects of algorithm governance in health systems. While the name oversimplifies it, we at times call this AI governance in a box, with the intent to identify some aspects of governance that are broadly replicable and scalable. Finally, we also provide support to Health AI Partnership, a multi-stakeholder learning network and platform launched in December 2021, with the goal of facilitating safe, effective, and responsible diffusion of AI software in healthcare delivery settings. These projects help to highlight two current tenets of the work. One, an initial focus on health systems, and two, an emphasis on collaboration across organizations. Today, many of these demonstration projects are necessarily taking place within health systems. Health systems have essentially all of the care delivery, the vast majority of data, and much of the expertise. When it comes to health AI use cases, health systems wear several hats in the AI product lifecycle, from developing models internally to validating external models with their data, to implementing, deploying, and evaluating these models when integrated into care delivery. It's important to note, though, that many of these health systems that are taking on this work today are of a particular type: large delivery systems with opportunities for scale economies, better resourced and better funded health systems with affiliations and partnerships with sophisticated university-based or homegrown data and computer science departments, and those with historic investments in IT and data assets, namely not your average health system. Ultimately, a robust system of clinical AI testing that will benefit all health systems will require the development of a multi-sector ecosystem with broad participation from both different resourced health systems, as well as representatives from industry, vendors, and regulatory and policymaking communities. We intend for the successes and failures that emerge from this portfolio of work to guide the who, what, when, where, why, and how of this testing approach. I'll close these introductory remarks by emphasizing the importance of collaboration. These demonstrations are meant to surface and lay the foundation for what comes next. In that spirit, we are actively designing approaches that support learning opportunities within each project, across projects, and between projects and external stakeholders. With that, I'll hand it back to the Stat News team.
Thank you, Tommy, for the introduction. Here to join me for today's discussion, please welcome Dr. Vinnie Liu, Research Scientist and Regional Medical Director at Kaiser Permanente, Dr. Melissa McCradden, a bioethicist and integration lead and Director of Artificial Intelligence in Medicine at the Hospital for Sick Children in Toronto, and Dr. Ziad Obermeyer, Associate Professor and Blue Cross of California Distinguished Professor at UC Berkeley. Thank you all for joining me today. I wanted to offer a brief prelude to frame our discussion, and then we'll dive right into the Q&A. In the press releases I so often get, AI is cast as the conquering hero whose impending conquest is roughly all of medicine. It can detect diseases and patient deterioration quicker. It can help doctors make better decisions. It can take away the administrative burdens that so frequently frustrate caregivers. And these are all true things. And the promise is real and positive. But as in all great stories, whether fiction or nonfiction, our hero is imperfect. Sometimes AI gets things wrong. It has biases. And in the worst case, it may even be racist, as it reflects the blind spots and misperceptions embedded in our data. These problems have been described and are broadly understood by the people paying closest attention, which is why we've all seen lots of AI best practices and frameworks, the AI Bill of Rights from the White House and so forth. But what all of this lacks is action, tangible steps to redress the harms, to head them off, to fill the deep translational void between press release and practice. We invited these people here today because they are actively working to fill that void, and we want to get a report from the trenches. So I wanted to start off a little differently than usual by giving each of them a couple of minutes to describe the present work they're undertaking. Melissa, why don't you start us off?
Sure. Thank you so much for the invitation to speak today. So I'm coming to you from Toronto, Canada, at the Hospital for Sick Children, where I'm a clinical ethicist. So I consult on difficult cases as well as organizational ethics issues. And I think Tommy's introduction really highlighted how the oversight of AI in healthcare systems is an issue of organizational ethics because it concerns what we should do, how we should go about doing it. I'm also an associate scientist at the Sick Kids Research Institute, where I do research engaging young people to query their views on AI, as we talk a lot with adults, but we don't always talk with our pediatric patients to integrate their views into how we should go about doing AI. And then as the John and Melinda Thompson Director of AI in Medicine, I oversee the integration arm, where I'm one of the team members who's coming up with the frameworks, including the processes and best practices to test, evaluate, develop, and measure the impact of AI systems in healthcare. And so two of the big projects that are going on here at SickKids include one as a translation framework. So identifying what kinds of practices should we be doing when we're developing models that are intended to impact patient care, how we should go about collecting the evidence to support their ability to make an impact on a particular task. And then finally, how we actually measure how we're doing. So linking the performance of a model to actual patient outcomes to make sure that we are delivering high quality care. The second project involves a fairness guideline, which is intended to support the identification, mitigation, and redress of bias issues that arise within machine learning. So helping teams know how to go about consulting affected groups, how to go about engaging best practices, some of which include the work by my co-panelist, Dr. Obermeyer. And so surfacing different ways of designing machine learning models that can address those forms of bias, with ultimately the goal to affect outcomes and redress health disparities. So that's just a window into what's going on here at SickKids, where I think we very much resonated with the opening comments of taking seriously the need to take accountability over the oversight of AI systems.
Great, thank you. Vinny, do you want to jump in next?
Yeah, so thank you very much for the invitation, and it's a pleasure to join my panelists here. And Casey, I think you put it right. We're in the trenches here at Kaiser Permanente. So I'm a clinician. I'm also a research scientist where I lead a NIH-funded program in using EHR data and machine learning for conditions like sepsis. From an operational standpoint, I work with many of my phenomenal colleagues to implement real-time AI and machine learning and predictive modeling applications for healthcare regional system here in Northern California that serves 4.5 million patients, but includes 8,000 to 9,000 physicians and tens of thousands of other staff, including our exemplary nurses. And so really for us, it's about how do we take these algorithms and how do we bring them out in a safe, effective, and sustainable way. Last week, we just held a KP Algorithmic Equity Virtual Symposium where there was almost 400 unique attendees from KP, where we had internal and external guests, and that's the work of the trenches. It's teaching, it's building frameworks, it's and then allowing them to be applied across all of our tools. I think Tommy alluded to work that we're doing that's called AIM High, Augmented Intelligence in Medicine and Healthcare Initiative, where we're trying to share knowledge that we've developed and fund 3 to 5 health systems external to KP to do rigorous evaluation of the implementation of AI tools. And that's something that we've learned a lot about over these past 5 years and been able to share our results in the peer-reviewed literature. But it's a challenging process. And so how do we build best practices and scalable opportunities for us to learn and, as you say, really put AI to the test?
Great, thank you. And Ziad?
I do research at the intersection of clinical medicine. I trained as a doctor and AI. And I think on a personal note, as I have done this research, one of the things that won't surprise anyone in this field, but I think is quite surprising to people outside of this field, is what an enormous bottleneck it is to get access to data. So I think, whether I'm doing research on building algorithms that help doctors make decisions or doing research on algorithms that go wrong, algorithms that incorporate racial bias or other kinds of problems, a really important ingredient to that work is data. And it is really, really hard to get access to data, whether you're someone who's building algorithms or someone who wants to evaluate other people's algorithms for performance. And so I'll just tell you about 2 things that I've done in that area, because I do think that is a big reason for this discrepancy between the press releases that Casey gets all the time and the realities of the fact that your doctor's office looks pretty much the same way it did in 1995. And none of this stuff is, to a first approximation, helping any doctors or any patients, at the nationwide level. And so one organization that I co-founded is a nonprofit called Nightingale Open Science. And that is an organization that uses philanthropic funding, including from the Moore Foundation. Thank you, Tommy, to build up interesting data sets and get those data to researchers to let them write papers. And, we run Kaggle-style challenges. We do challenges with a particular eye to ensuring that algorithms are fair and equitable and unbiased. And so that's very much in the domain of helping researchers build algorithms and incorporate some of those important checks and balances and make it transparent, because all of the data are transparent. Anyone can look at your work and see how it's doing. The second organization is a for-profit company called Dandelion. And Dandelion is, that when we set up this company, the goal was to get data in a safe and ethical way into the hands of people who want to build clinical products that actually make it into the clinic. And so that's the main focus of the company. But along the way, one of the things we realized was that these data could also be incredibly valuable for people who wanted to evaluate their own algorithms and see how they were doing in other data. If you build an algorithm at your hospital, it's really, really difficult to know if that if that algorithm is going to work outside of your hospital, or whether it's just very specific to the place where you built the algorithm. And so again, with the support of the Moore Foundation, we've set up a free public service for algorithm audits. So this is starting with electrocardiogram-based algorithms, algorithms that read electrocardiograms and produce useful predictions for doctors to use. Anyone, whether you're a researcher, a company, you can upload your algorithm into a secure environment. We will run that algorithm on our data on whatever label you choose, however you want to evaluate that algorithm performance, and we'll send you back a report for how well that algorithm is doing, both overall and importantly across key population subgroups by race, ethnicity, geography, socioeconomics, et cetera. And so I think, my view is that a big part of what we need right now is more people using data, both to produce algorithms that travel across hospitals and across countries and settings, and evaluate those algorithms for both overall performance and for equity. And data is really the key bottleneck to that right now. I think it's why the market isn't working to produce these things in a high performance and fair way.
Great, thank you. And thank you everybody for jumping in so quickly with questions. I am going to ask the first one, but I will get into the Q&A very quickly here. This is something that sort of cuts across something everybody sort of brought up in their introductions. AI is, it's often described as, sort of being neutral and objective in delivering its output or its prediction into a clinical setting or a workflow. Why is that not really the case? And what implication does that have for fairness and sort of how we respond then to its output? Melissa, do you want to start with that?
Sure. Yeah, it's an excellent question. And I think that a lot of people, the hope was that if you just get enough data, you sort of even out different biases that might happen. But what we see is that because AI fundamentally is an associationist methodology, it looks at patterns and things that go together commonly. And so because of that, even signals in data that are by themselves considered neutral, they embed some of these larger societal patterns. So even if you look, for example, at something like waveform data, which looks pretty neutral, you're directly measuring, heart function, for example. The way that heart performs is shaped not only by someone's biology and physiology and genetics, but also by their life experiences, environmental stressors, other forms of stress that people experience. And so it fundamentally affects the patterns. So anytime we're dealing with data where patterns are embedded, we have to consider what societal features might have influenced how those patterns are expressed in data.
Thank you. I'm going to jump to a question from a guest, John Barbudo, who asks, the pivotal issue of healthcare is expectations. And in the US arena, expectations pivot largely on standard of care. How do you plan to address legal acceptance that AI systems, even where not perfect, meet standards of care? Vinny, do you want to tackle that one?
I'll try. I'm not sure if I totally understand the question. I think there is, unfortunately, a little bit of a fallacy that, current standard of care is not biased or is perfect. And I think that's partly because sometimes it's hard to quantify those decisions. When we use data for all of its flaws and challenges, as well as its opportunities, we are able to quantify decision making in a way that reveals patterns. And so I think that there is the opportunity, if we are able to kind of fully metricize this system, really to understand what the downstream impacts of those would be, make choices about whether those algorithms and the subsequent decisions really follow through with our, practice standards, professional society guidelines, or other regulatory definitions of standards of care. So I'm not totally sure that that's what the question is about, but I think that we use tools every day, and you wouldn't take a scissor and try to use it as a screwdriver. You might in one scenario, but you think of these algorithms, they are up till now, when not before we talk about generative AI, they've really been, you give it one task and the computer just relentlessly tries to achieve the best performance for that task. Now, if you switch the task from what you asked it to do to some other application, or the data are faulty, or many other things, you now run into a situation where the performance which you expect is not the performance which you're going to receive. And I think that's, I think at the end of the day, that's one of the struggles that the field is facing. And it involves the integration of the tool into practice, and understanding what the implications, are for the way that we direct care.
Can I add just one quick thing to that? I totally agree, Vinny, with everything you said, and especially the using tools part of it. I think there's often this implicit comparison of AI in medicine to like self-driving cars, where the self-driving car might or might not be held to a different standard than a human driver and safety and things like that. But I just want to kind of make a claim, which is that that's not what we're talking about here. Like, I think it's very hard to imagine any setting in medicine where you'd have an unsupervised AI just like doing stuff without a doctor in the loop. And so I think these things are tools that doctors are going to use. And I think these tools are going to make doctors better at doing the things that doctors are already doing. Testing the right patients, treating the right patients, things like so. I don't think there's any incompatibility with the current view of the standard of care. I think these tools are just going to help doctors do better with respect to the same standards that we've always been using.
I want to echo the importance, I think, of the comment about tools, because we do have tools across medicine that have variable levels of performance. If you do a CT scan, you have a relative degree of confidence that if you're seeing a break in the bone, that's a break in the bone. It gets more difficult with things like prognosis, where we might be predicting the risk of some potential outcome. And I think one of the things that our patients have told us really, really strongly is that they really resonate with the idea of AI as a tool, because they can envision a person that is accountable for their care, who is making a decision that also incorporates their values, their perspective, and their context. And I think one of the things that I'm hearing in the question is some of the concerns that are raised by clinicians, because they are effectively, they're in a position common to both Canada and the US, where they are the learned intermediaries. So you as an individual, you're responsible for knowing what you need to know about a system. And so this puts clinicians in a difficult position. But what's also common across our jurisdictions is that clinicians are not held to the standard of perfect accuracy when they're making decisions. They're held to the standard of reasonableness. So they need to have good reasons behind any clinical decision or medical recommendation that might be. And so if we're taking into account what we know about a machine learning model, with the context perhaps on the unit that day, with the context of the patient and their social complexities as well, then we can make reasoned decisions that do not rely on perfectly performing algorithms nor explainable algorithms, but just on making the best decision with the information that we have at that time.
Thank you. I think that actually works in nicely to a question that was posed by my friend Irv Lowe. Thanks, Irv, for coming. His question is, how do you envision regulatory standardization being implemented and deployed with so many players, foreign and domestic, being active? And then he also asks a sort of corollary question about management of deepfake data or sort of generative AI data being inadvertently integrated into clinical data on which we end up depending. I will make that one a jump ball if somebody wants to jump in on that first part.
I can take a stab at it, Casey. I think it's a great question. And I think I've found it very useful to reason kind of by analogy to the way the FDA regulates drugs. So drugs do a bunch of different stuff. They treat a bunch of different conditions. They're delivered in a bunch of, so there's a lot of variety in drugs. And I think as much as there is in AI. And so I think the trick for the regulator is two things. One is basically setting the right yardstick. So with drugs, we pick a primary outcome. We say, this is the thing that the drug is supposed to improve. So that's really important. And I think that that's very similar for algorithms. We have to be very clear about, okay, what is the information that this algorithm is supposed to be producing? How would we know if this algorithm is right? So there's a metric that's set out, and it's like, this is what the algorithm should be doing. And then the second thing is there's a accepted methodological way of answering that question of like, is the algorithm doing what it's supposed to do? And in drugs and some high-risk devices, it's a randomized trial. And I think we don't yet have that for algorithms. And I think that's part of the problem. I think the FDA, that they're in a bit of a tough position because I think what they'd like to say is to say, okay, what is the analogy of the randomized trial for algorithms? Not saying that you shouldn't run randomized trials for algorithms. I'm doing that. I know Vinny is also doing that. I think that's really important. But I think there's another thing, which is to say, okay, you have an algorithm. Now it should travel to some other data set that the algorithm has never seen before. And we should be able to measure that thing that we want to measure and see how the algorithm is doing. And so I think that those are the two things that, at least if I were waving a magic wand, I would have the regulators do, is to have people define a metric that's sensible, like this is the target the algorithm should be hitting. And then this is the way that we want to validate that in an independent data set. And I think to go back to the thing that I always harp on, it really illustrates the importance of having those independent data sets in which those kinds of evaluations can be done. Because just like we don't tend to take Merck or Pfizer's word when they tell us, oh, in our data, it looks great, you should approve this drug. It also would be weird if we were taking people's word on the fact that the algorithm is performing great in their data and we didn't have a trust but verify situation in the algorithm world as well.
I think one of the things we can add to that as well, like recognizing the emphasis on measuring that algorithm performance, is also linking that to the conditions and practices that surround the use of the algorithm. So, we know that if I were to provide you with a drug and say, this has received regulatory approval to treat condition X, that's all well and good, but we also need to know the dose. We need to know the patient age range it was tested on. We need to know at what stage in the disease trajectory we might need to do. We need to know the specific actions that are linked with achieving that benefit. And so, increasingly, we might look to measuring not only the algorithm performance, but also the set of practices that surround the use of that algorithm that together are linked with that patient benefit that we're hoping to see.
Yeah, and I'll jump in here because I think these are really important points. I mean, I think, again, if we use the tool analogy, these AI instruments in the way that they're used today are actually deployed in many different fashions, as Melissa says. And so, the regulations surrounding, the performance of it itself is only one, actually kind of a modest piece of the entire pipeline for what it will produce in terms of patient benefit. That still analogizes to drugs, because we know that even after an effective, therapy has been identified in a set of randomized trials, it still could take decades for that treatment to be deployed effectively across the population. That being said, I think what we are also seeing in the field is that, tools may be best, the algorithms may perform best when they're trained on local data, or perhaps customized to the data of a specific setting in which they're deployed. And I think that has to do with the fact that data is not universal. Even across, one system, you're going to have various quality issues, and those probably relate to, lots of choices that propagate, over that pipeline from what happens in reality to what gets represented in the data set. So, I mean, I think there has to be some allowance for understanding, is an algorithm that performs universally well across independent data sets better or not as good as algorithms which are very much tuned to the location in which they're deployed. And there's a lot of work still to be done there.
Yeah, one of the frustrating things for me, at least when I read FDA filings of cleared or approved products, is that you read, the summary documents, which are public facing about the testing, performance, and clinical that was done, but you don't really know, when you're going to the point of saying, okay, well, I'm going to adopt this product in my health system. Is it actually going to work? How similar are my patients to this data set? Like, is there a way to cut through that where we have some kind of an independent benchmarking way of really finding out if something's ready for, diffusion?
Yeah, I mean, I'll jump in there again because we do a lot of this real world deployment. And I would say, even if the algorithm works perfectly on the data as expected, you could still have a complete failure in terms of that technology impacting outcomes. So I think we just really have to be sensitive about there's an algorithmic component. And as Ziad says, that should be mathematically defined. We have standard metrics. We should have independent data sets. That all makes sense. So the box is performing the way it should. And yet that thing then needs to make its way into the complex world of how we treat patients. And we can have, the funny thing is you could have a perfect algorithm that fails completely because of this second stage. You could actually have an imperfect algorithm that is a smashing success. That's because a system is deploying it effectively. And I think people don't get that interplay today as much as it's a reality.
Yeah, I think that's why the human component is so important with this. So, the Duke group, Madeline Claire Ellish's work that described these as socio-technical systems. They're not just like a little mathematical product in a box. They're intrinsically linked to the practices of the people around them. So if the nurse who's interpreting that output knows exactly what to do and proceed with that, you can have an imperfect algorithm. You can have, a range of performances. But if that nurse knows what to do, then you can effectuate patient care. And so this is why I think as institutions, one of the things that we can look to is how our existing work around patient safety and quality metrics allow us to try and measure and maintain a certain standard of care and continually move toward improving that standard of care by measuring what actually happens to our patients.
Yeah, I think it's really important to break out those very different parts of the pipeline because each of them has their own separate measurement and evaluation pipeline. So, for the FDA to approve a drug, the pharma company runs the randomized trial and it shows that there's a treatment control difference and then the drug is approved. To know if that drug is a good drug for society, if doctors are prescribing it, if patients are taking it, that's a whole separate evaluation metric, and that's different. And so I think, just as we have that pipeline with separate evaluation steps and separate actors doing things for drugs and devices, I think we need that kind of same understanding of the links in the chain for AI as well. And I think it's a really useful distinction that you both made.
And I want to get back to some of the questions from guests, and Chantal Warzala asks one that I think about a lot and I think is important to raise here. Do any of the best practices and frameworks look at AI use for non-clinical purposes, scheduling, documentation, coding, revenue cycle management, those sorts of things? I would point out, especially if this is happening in the generative AI discussion, those things are all low risk, so we can go ahead and experiment and maybe put those things in place. But wait, are they really low risk? I mean, if that's used in a way that that is inaccurate, that can really, really hurt me as a patient in various ways. Do any of you have some thoughts on that?
I can comment on it just because this has been such an active area of research for me. So have done work on algorithms that are used in population health management to prioritize who gets access to high-risk care management programs. And I think that that's, one of those things that, like so many areas in clinical medicine, they're a little bit operational, but everything operational is ultimately clinical. If you don't buy enough PPE or masks, that's a purchasing procurement decision, but it sure matters for a lot of clinical things. And so I don't think there's a really sharp distinction between these things, because all of these operational decisions made in the context of a health system end up affecting patients one way or another. And so, when we looked at the way that a lot of algorithms were working to prioritize patients for pop health interventions, we found an enormous amount of racial bias in those algorithms. There's also some work on scheduling systems. So rebooking patients because they're at high risk of no-shows seems, uncontroversial. Seems like we should just use the primary care slots in the best way possible. But the patients who get disproportionately canceled are not just the patients who decide not to show up, they're the patients who can't show up because of barriers to access and transportation and cost. So that ends up penalizing needy patients as well. And so I think that this is another area where, you don't necessarily, I don't think you necessarily need to run a randomized trial for each of these things, especially for these kinds of operational decisions. But you do really need to articulate, okay, this is exactly what the algorithm is predicting. This is what we want it to be predicting. And here's how we would measure if that algorithm is performing well and performing equitably when it's deployed. And so I think it's a really important set of questions that often gets buried because it is on the back end of the hospital system, and it's away from where people are paying attention to these issues of performance and equity.
I think one of the currently most underestimated practices in this entire pipeline is what's commonly called either the shadow evaluation or silent trial period, where we're observing prospectively the performance of a model, but the outputs of the model are not actually effectuating care or healthcare delivery or administrative functions. Because that sort of provides us with a buffer between a period where we've developed an algorithm that we think has some potential to have a meaningful impact on care delivery or administrative functions, but also actually using it. And so if you take that period where you're observing the performance of the algorithm and assessing it against real world evidence, so having someone assess, if this was the prediction, is this actually what happened? You can collect that on the ground evidence to make sure that that system you're implementing is functioning the way that you think it is. So just as an example, because generative AI has been brought up a lot, this is a super difficult one because you don't necessarily have some perfectly accurate thing that you're comparing it against. So if we were to consider its use for aid with clinical documentation, which is something that a lot of people are interested in, one of the challenges is that, it's not intended to generate truthful outputs. It's intended to generate outputs that look like outputs it's seen before, but you don't know that the outputs that it's generating for that patient are actually true to that patient. And so you could have this observation period whereby you observe how it's performing, you observe potentially the error rates, the number of times that a clinician has to correct something manually, how often they make errors for particular categories of patients. You could use that period to evaluate it prior to actually having it go live, where it's actually affecting care or care delivery. And I think this applies to administrative systems as well. So if you're looking at an algorithm for screening job applicants or scheduling patients, you can do a similar step in between the kind of development of the algorithm and the implementation.
Yeah, and I agree with all those points. And I would even extend it further, which is to say, we have to develop ongoing monitoring systems, not only for the algorithm performance, but ultimately the impact. Because I think even again, if you have that perfect algorithm, you do the silent prospective validation, it performs the way that you expect it to. There's so many other factors that are related to its impact on patient outcomes, like, for example, an unbiased model, but that then shows in part not unfair allocation of visits, let's say. We need to have systems to be able to monitor that proactively. And I think work from Ziad and others have shown and just the history of medicine, we can't depend on good intentions to be a yardstick. I think we really need to be careful about this and proactive.
How would you go about the public reporting, based on that monitoring? Like, for example, if you find a tool that's deployed, or maybe it's deployed within an EHR and that tool happens to be used widely across many different systems, should there be some kind of a system, a public facing or system to sort of say, okay, well, we've discovered this problem and it's really impacted the accuracy of the model or its impact on care? How do you go about that?
So, I'll take a stab here. I think we should still use a lot of the same frameworks we have for quality measures. Ultimately, the goal is not the algorithm. This is why we call it augmented intelligence, because, that places people, patients, clinicians, communities, rather than the algorithms at its center, right? It's a tool. I don't think we should be reporting on ongoing algorithmic performance. What we need to report is the specific objective, which Ziad mentioned. What are we trying to achieve? If it's hypertension control, if it's earlier sepsis, better sepsis outcomes, if it's the closure of an existing disparity in some kind of, across racial ethnic groups, I think we have places where those types of outcomes reported. And it's a question of when we surround an algorithm or a technology tool within this larger ecosystem of the way that we approach that care, what do we achieve? Because I think, as you alluded to, Casey, in your beginning, there's the promise that this tool will change everything. like it will, reduce the outcome rate by 50%. And for many of the use cases, I think it will be an incremental addition that will hopefully make us more effective, more efficient, and safe. But it alone is unlikely to drive just a massive benefit, in many cases.
A guest, Keith Winter, asks a relevant question I wanted to raise to all of you. He says, regarding equity and bias, are there techniques that can be used to adjust the bias or counteract it? A recent example may be Samba in R. The reason I think that's an important question is so often we kind of talk about equity and bias as this scourge that cannot be addressed, but there are techniques, there are ways to go about dealing with these things. Can you talk about the types of techniques that are in play and that can be particularly useful?
I can maybe distinguish these techniques into two big buckets that I find helpful to think about. So I think that there's a set of tools that are often packaged up in R or Python that are really useful when you have the right metric that you're evaluating the algorithm on. So if you're happy with the thing that the algorithm is predicting, and you just want to make sure that it's predicting it well in different subgroups and different populations, then I think there are many options, and I think that's super useful. I think that if you run all of those checks and your algorithm passes, there's still a huge potential problem, which is that the metric that you're evaluating the algorithm on is not the right metric. And so that's the second bucket, which I think there's no R package for, which is figuring out, is your algorithm doing the thing that it's supposed to be doing? And in all of the research that I've done, the big problems with algorithms have not been in this first bucket, they've been in the second bucket. So in algorithms that were prioritizing people for population health management priority, those algorithms were predicting how much someone was going to cost over the next year and prioritizing the high predicted cost people for extra help. If you ran all of those R packages, like that algorithm would have passed with flying colors. The problem was over here, that the algorithm was predicting cost as a proxy for health. So it was basically equating cost with need for healthcare. But the problem is that not everybody who needs healthcare gets healthcare. And when people who need healthcare but don't get it, don't get healthcare, they don't generate costs. And so that algorithm was predicting the wrong thing. And in so doing, it was introducing a huge amount of racial bias, socioeconomic bias, geographic bias, all of the other biases, because it was predicting the wrong thing. So by all means, these automated checks are super useful, but they are no substitute for making sure that what the algorithm is doing is the correct thing for it to be doing in this particular setting. That is something that only a human can do.
Yeah, and the other thing too is that we do have all of those, and like Ziad said, it has to be doing the right thing. But how we decide what that right thing is dependent partly on the use case and on the nature of the health inequity. So just as an example, let's say we have a patient who's a candidate for a transplant. The decision about, let's say we have a model that is predicting their risk of developing post-op complications. Fundamentally, that is a calculation of risk versus benefit to that particular patient. And so in that case, we might want to know what potential structural biases might be affecting that individual's chances. In another situation, that same patient could be placed on a transplant list. In that case, we might not want to account for structural biases, knowing that there are issues with equity in terms of placement on the list. We might want to think about how can we treat all patients with similar clinical features the same. Finally, that same patient could be in a situation where they are underrepresented in terms of access to specialist care by getting onto a transplant list. In that case, we might actually think about fairness from a perspective of equity, where we might say there's a particular group that's underrepresented. What design choices could we make to our algorithm in order to improve their access to care in order to address that health disparity? So all of the choices that we make about algorithm design are dependent on what action we want to have on the basis of that, which is really particular to the use case and to the health disparity that we're trying to address.
Yeah, I totally agree. There's a lot of human judgment and values here. So we can use tools, and in some cases, in many cases, the tool is not going to achieve perfection in all the bias metrics. Like some of them are mathematically opposed to one another. So as you optimize one, you degrade another. And I think what that speaks to is, again, what we've just heard. It's values that we apply on achieving some health aim. It depends on what our intention is. And so I think there's the hope that mathematical approaches are going to solve all of these issues, but I think the reality is it's actually much more complex. We can use these advanced techniques to optimize, but they are going to be they need to be guided and deployed based on what intentions we have in the choices we're making.
Another question from a guest, Charlotte Rapkin Califat, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. How can we effectively and at scale ensure AI models apps are tested not just against human labeled data, but are trained and tested against biomarkers and or patient outcomes? Are technologies like bulk transfer part of the answer? How are ethics managed?
Well, I mean, I'll put a plug in for Ziad's work. I mean, there was a New York Times article the other day talking about the Google antitrust lawsuit related to search, and it said data is their oxygen. That is the place we must be at in healthcare. Data is or for folks like us who work in this algorithmic space, and data is our oxygen. And so that is both data from clinical standpoint that is interchangeable, interoperable, and transparent data that is prospectively collected data. So it catches trends that are, not from the 1990s, but from 2023, and it gets updated. And then that is data across multimodal data. So, getting down to biological processes and other, yet to emerge pieces of understanding of human biology and pathophysiology. So I think all of us aspire to that. Data is our oxygen. And with that, we can, use those data to inform and drive new insights.
Yeah, thanks, Vinny. I totally agree with that. And I really appreciate the question. I think, again, people outside this field don't appreciate how hard it is to write down what a diagnosis is. So, it's very tempting to say, okay, well, how do I train an algorithm to read this X-ray? well, I'm just going to look at what the radiologist said about this X-ray. And if the radiologist said that this patient had pneumonia, then I'm going to teach the AI to like call this pneumonia. The problem is that that pneumonia diagnosis is not the truth. That's just someone's opinion. And, you know, doctors are great. Our opinions are valid. They're useful. But when you set up an algorithm to just replicate what a human is doing, you're also setting up that algorithm to replicate all of the human's problems. And in some case, exaggerate those problems relative to the human herself. And so I think it really highlights the importance of, rather than training the AI to replicate human judgment, train the algorithm to replicate patient outcomes and longitudinal things that happen to that patient and other sources of truth. I think the problem, you know, and I think that the question really astutely brought up, like, well, what's the obstacle? Is it that we don't have fire? Is it that things aren't interoperable? I mean, yes, that all of the plumbing for the data that gets that oxygen that Vinny was talking about to, you know, to the people who can breathe it in, it's a disaster. But I actually don't think that's the real problem. The real problem is that it takes a ton of very specialized knowledge to go through this incredibly messy data that comes out of, like, that's the exhaust of the healthcare system, and turn that into something that is credibly a real diagnosis that AI can learn. And, you know, the plumbing and the disarray of our healthcare data doesn't make that easy, but it's not just a plumbing issue. It's an expertise issue. You need people who both really understand the data and people who understand the clinical realities and how to turn that data into a diagnosis that is actually, you know, useful. And so I think it's really, really hard work. And I think our educational system is not producing a ton of people who can do that work because, you know, the medical training system is not producing people who know how to do data, and the computer science, statistics, you know, technical pathways are not producing people who have spent a bunch of time in healthcare learning about how to do this work. So I think we have a huge human capital problem alongside the plumbing problem with the data.
We also can't forget that patients have expertise as well. And there's cases throughout, you know, medical history where we've measured outcomes that are relevant and important to mainly to physicians, and that's certainly something that we should do. But there's also a lot of advancement to be made in having patients help us select what outcomes are most meaningful to them and bringing them into the algorithm design process.
Yeah, and like training algorithms to predict what patients say about their X-ray rather than what doctors say about their X-ray is a very, very useful trick that I've used in research before. So I want to highlight that point. Thanks, Melissa.
Well, thank you all for the excellent questions and excellent answers. And I can't believe I'm saying already that we're unfortunately out of time, and I've only gotten to a fraction of the questions that were asked. So thank you nonetheless for asking those and the active participation from the audience. Thanks again to Dr. Liu, Melissa McCradden, and Ziad Obermeyer for joining me today and for answering these great questions from the audience. Thanks to our event partner, the Gordon and Betty Moore Foundation, and to all of you out there for taking the time to join us. Stats Summit is upcoming and will be taking place October 16th to 18th in Boston, and it will be available virtually. So please do join us and check that out. STAT will take a look at the entire healthcare system, incorporating the perspectives of innovators, those on the medical front lines, and patients. We'll sit down with top executives, key scientists, economists, and health outcomes researchers to look for solutions. More information can be found on our website. So thanks again to you all. A special thanks to our speakers today. And thank you all so much for joining.